has been torn, well, the passage from S1 to the next stage would satisfy the conditions in P3. God's next choice has been torn from his hands. He learned immediately after stage S1 what he, God himself, chose to prohibit before he actually chose it. Perhaps if the answer to a query would rob God of his freedom with respect to a creative act not yet settled, the result of God's choice to ask for this information is something like the answer a magic 8-ball often gives, ask again later. Of course, this is all just total picture thinking, and please don't stone me. But if the query delivers an answer, then there would be a causal explanatory loop, including God's choice to create and prohibit apples and his prior knowledge of something that implied he would do so. So that can't happen. God can't get that sort of foreknowledge about the future. To rule out such irrational goings-on in the mind of God, I propose a further principle about stages, P4. If God freely decides to make P true, and the fact that God so decides is not a part of stage S, then for every querying of the future God could perform immediately after S, every possible answer to the query must be consistent with God's deciding either way. Otherwise, one must countenance the idea that although God hasn't yet decided whether to do or allow something, he peeks ahead for more information and discovers, that he's done it. He has to do it. Simply deciding to put free creatures in free circumstances and then seeing ahead of time what they'll do is not problematic in the same way. By hypothesis, God doesn't choose what they do. So discovering what they do poses no paradoxes about God's choices being taken from his hands or rendered irrational. Since he's decided to create the creatures and leave them free, stages prior to the point at which God learns of their choices presumably include a good reason to allow them to freely decide in these circumstances. So far, though, so good. It would appear that God could move from S1 to S2 by making selective use of his foreknowledge, so long as P's truth is consistent with God's choosing either L or R. So if P is true on both sides, God could ask, okay, what's Adam going to be doing? And if he gets the answer, eating an apple, he could use this, apparently, and say, okay, well, then I'm going to prohibit pears. Well, not so fast. Instances of querying the future that yield knowledge that doesn't rob God of choices not yet made may still require something very much like conditionals of freedom that inform God what free creatures and God himself either would or will do in various non-actual circumstances. Or it may lead to a kind of absurdity I'm going to try to bring out. In our example, God has, by S1, chosen to create Eve, but has not chosen between L and R. After acquiring the knowledge that leads to stage 2, God knows some important things about Eve's potential temptation by either a snake with apples or a snake with pears. The fact that P is true rules out the other possibilities on which it is not true, leaving only 2 branches, thus helping God with his choice between L and R. Ruling those other branches out implies that if God makes and prohibits apples, taking the right-hand branch, then Eve will freely sin. And then at the next node, we'll offer apples to Adam, who will in turn freely choose to eat them. The fact that P is true implies something about which choices will be made if God chooses the left-hand side as well. She will be offering Adam apples at T in those circumstances too, and he will freely accept them. Now, what kinds of conditionals are these, which God knows, about what Eve and Adam will freely do if tempted in ways they will never be tempted? On the right-hand side. One possibility, of course, is just that they're the Molinist conditionals of freedom. But in that case, peeking ahead isn't an independent way, independent of Molinism, for God's foreknowledge to provide God with providentially useful information. David Hunt will not be satisfied with this answer because he wanted simple foreknowledge to be providentially useful in such circumstances. Let's assume that God will actually offer Eve pears. If Molinism is not true and God does not offer Eve apples, then the following subjunctive conditional is not true. Were Eve offered apples, she would freely sin. So this conditional cannot be a part of what God knows at S2. Nevertheless, God knows at S2, prior to God's knowing whether he will tempt her with apples or pears, that either Eve will not be tempted with apples or she will sin by accepting forbidden fruit. This is enough information to guide God's decision to choose L, forbidding pears, and increasing the chances of Eve's doing the right thing. So God at least has the material conditional, if P then Q, which is equivalent to either not P or Q. Well, wait a minute. Take that back. There is this material conditional, if P then Q. It is equivalent to either not P or Q, And so the disjunctive information that God has about Eve does support the material conditional. If Eve is tempted with apples, then she will sin. Could Hunt suppose that it is not conditionals of freedom of the Molinistic sort, but rather mere material conditionals of this sort that God knows, and that allow him to use simple foreknowledge in the way envisaged? Now here's a sort of first stab, an older version of this paper, this was as far as I got, a sort of first stab at arguing that no, God couldn't acquire this material conditional, this disjunctive information, and use it to decide to use the left-hand fork. You might be inclined, I was inclined, to argue as follows. God's knowledge that if Eve is tempted with apples, she will sin, is supposed to be equivalent to either Eve is not tempted with apples or she sins, a disjunction with, we are supposing, a false first disjunct and a true second disjunct. When a simple truth-functional disjunction is true, but one disjunct is false, the truth of the disjunction as a whole is dependent upon the truth of the other disjunct. Since Eve was tempted with pears and sinned, the truth of the disjunction and of the material conditional is dependent upon the fact that Eve really did sin. In general, then, true material conditionals about circumstances of free choice that actually come about are dependent upon the truth of the consequent. They're true because of what the creature in fact does. Perhaps a material conditional describing what a certain creature does freely might follow from some other truth, a truth that nevertheless does not imply that the creature actually acts in the way described. For example, a Molinistic conditional of freedom to the effect that if Eve were tempted, she would sin, well, that ought to imply the truth of the material conditional, if Eve is tempted, then Eve sins. But we're assuming that such conditionals of freedom are not true. If a true material conditional does not follow from a true proposition of this sort, then its truth depends upon the truth of the antecedent. That is, it depends upon the fact that the creature exists and acts in this way. And if God must rely upon material conditionals about what Eve will do because there are no true subjunctive or counterfactual conditionals describing what Eve would freely do or would freely have done in various circumstances, then there are no other truths, independent of the fact that Eve freely sins, which could imply the material conditional, if Eve is tempted with apples, then she will sin. If what is true at the stages prior to God's decision to take the left or the right path cannot depend upon what truths implying that God takes L rather than R, then the material conditional about Eve and the apples is not true at stages prior to God's decision between left and right. Now, this argument is not watertight, as people have pointed out. One might, for example, reasonably wonder whether the same notion of dependence is invoked in the two claims. One claim is, true disjunctions with a false disjunct depend upon the truth of the remaining disjunct, and truths at the stage before God has decided what to do cannot depend upon things implying that God chooses one way rather than the other. You might think both are true, but these are different meanings of depend, and so this isn't a transitive notion. But the more one thinks about the idea that God is relying upon mere material conditionals, like if Eve is tempted with apples, then she sins, the worse it seems. There are a great many trivially true material conditionals about the free choices of possible creatures. For every possible creature X and circumstances of free choice C, if X never exists or is never in fact put in those circumstances, then material conditionals of both these forms are true. If X is in C, then X freely does A, and if X is in C, X freely refrains from doing A. They're both true. Now, it couldn't be the case that every true material conditional of this form is available prior to God's decision to create anything at all. What is true at that stage is supposed to be independent of God's decision to create any particular creatures. But assuming that what is available at the first stage is closed under entailment, that is, that their implications are also reasons that God has, which they must be if God is to be guided by knowing the contents of that stage, then these conditionals will imply that certain possible creatures will not be created. For example, both of these are true, and they together imply that my sister does not exist. If my sister exists in any circumstances at all, then she will sin, and if my sister exists in any circumstances at all, then she will not sin. But God better not know all of these material conditionals before he's decided what to create, or he'd know exactly which creatures are not going to be created. Could some special subset of the material conditionals